We now have something like at least a 20-year history and probably longer of custody courts chronically just refusing to protect children and refusing to look at the evidence. They're very fond in the custody courts of saying, well, it's just his word against hers, and we didn't have any evidence that he was abusing the children. And that's usually not true.
Hi, I'm Gretchen Baskerville, and I have the privilege of interviewing Lundy Bancroft, who is really an expert on abuse, intervention, and the author of a brand new book. It's a novel. Unlike Lundy's previous books on abuse, this book, In Custody, is a novel. It's the story of a mother who is not believed when she tells the court that her husband is abusive. And to make matters worse, the custody evaluator doesn't believe her or her daughter either and insists on joint custody with the father. Now, I run a 3,000 member private Facebook group for divorced Christians and other people of faith. And this kind of thing happens all the time. In Lundy's novel, we learn that the mother feels she has no choice but to run and escape in the night with the girl. And so Lundy, tell us why you wrote this novel and what you hope that women and, frankly, the courts will learn from it.
So I've always wanted to write a novel. So part of my motivation for writing a novel was just that it's something I've always wanted to do. But I'm really interested in how to bring social justice concepts to the public through much more entertaining means. I mean, people hit their limits on how much they can hear about injustices in the world or about terrible things that are happening to people, and they get to a point where they just can't absorb it. So I'm interested in the idea of like, how do you get messages across in a way that's humorous and has some romance in it and has some mystery in it, because I've just always loved mysteries, my whole life. And I was really inspired by the trilogy of the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, because the Stieg Larsson, who has passed away, he had a real mission to educate people actually about the same issue. His issue was male violence against women, as it has been mine. And that wasn't his only issue, but that was really what was driving him to write that series of books, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And those books are very hard to put down. They're really, they're 10 times better than mine. They're very suspenseful, and he was a very skilled writer. And even though I knew I couldn't remotely do what he had done, I still thought like, wow, this is actually a way to reach more people than if you wrote a book about violence against women. Most people in the US don't know this, but The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo was not the title of his book in Swedish. The title of his book in Swedish translates as women. And he had a mission. And so I thought, if I write a book about the corruption in the child custody system, I don't feel like I'm going to reach that many people. I feel if I write a novel about it, that's something that people enjoy reading, then maybe we can get this message to a lot more people. And it's actually going to be at least 2 books and quite likely 3, because the story has a couple more phases still to go. And it's going to take at least one more book to finish the big story. I mean, the story ends in a sense, but there's also pieces of it that remain. So it's going to be a 2 or even 3 book series. I'm going to be starting to work on the sequel soon.
Well, so, I think what really captured my imagination about this is that, this is the story of a woman who runs because she cannot get any kind of support, any kind of protection in court. And yet this is something that, I'm not even sure that how legal that is in court systems. And yet she does run, and she finds, I don't know if you allow me to give any spoilers, she finds an underground network. How common are these underground networks? Are these real, or is this part of your, part of the imagination of an author?
Well, they are real, but they're not common. there have been networks that have specifically helped women whose children were being abused and who could document that the children were being abused to flee with their child to safety, precisely because of the history. We now have something like at least a 20-year history, and probably longer, of custody courts chronically just refusing to protect children and refusing to look at the evidence. They're very fond in the custody courts of saying, well, it's just his word against hers, and we didn't have any evidence that he was abusing the children. And that's usually not true. Usually that's the court's excuse for refusing to look at the evidence. And in fact, one thing I decided to do in the novel is that my main character, who's a journalist, I had her find a lot of true real life cases and learn about them, and they're discussed in the novel, and they're quite shocking cases, and they're not cases where the court was stuck, like, oh, we don't know what to do, or we can't tell what's real here. They were all cases where the evidence was overwhelming, where nobody could possibly fail to conclude that a child was in great danger here and was being abused. And yet the court just decided to side with the abuser. And that's, a whole subject that we can go into if you want, is about, well, why does the court side with the abuser so often? More and more.
I think that would be a great topic to go into. So what happened, and why are the courts this way? Why is this happening so often, where there's clear-cut evidence, scientific, academic, medical evidence, and they're not taking it seriously?
Well, a number of things have changed. One is that starting really in the late 70s and 80s, governments got much stricter about collecting child support. Abusers used to be able to just kind of drift away and not have to pay their child support, which was infuriating. But we suddenly came to realize years later that it was actually better to let abusers just slip away, because once abusers were being forced to pay child support, they took an attitude of like, well, if I'm being forced to pay child support, then I'm going to get her back.
Oh boy, that's really true. That's very true. I saw that in my own case. Yep.
So the child support enforcement, which seemed like such a good thing at the time, I was certainly in favor of it at the time, really woke up a sleeping giant, because abusers didn't know that they could win in the custody court, and it was much better when they didn't know. And what started to happen in the 1980s is, because they were angry about child support, they started to fight, and they started to form huge organizations, where they weren't huge at first, obviously, but they became huge organizations called fathers' rights organizations. And on the surface of it, like, fathers' rights sounds like a good thing.
Who can argue with fathers' rights if they're being unfairly discriminated against? Who can argue with that?
Right. Fathers' rights, mothers' rights, children's rights, they're all important. Except those organizations weren't interested in pursuing the legitimate rights and interests of fathers, which the courts were actually, for the most part, fairly well serving. What they were interested in was fighting against child support, fighting against domestic violence disclosures, and fighting against sexual abuse disclosures. Mm-hmm. And I started in the mid-90s to read their literature, and it was very clear, like, they're not interested in the legitimate concerns of fathers. They're interested in attracting other abusers to their organizations. It was so clear in their language that that's who they were trying to recruit. So the growth of the fathers' rights movement has been an important factor. And unfortunately, they've done a very good job. I hate to say it, but they've done a very good job of organizing, kind of county by county, court by court, across the US. And then it has spread to a lot of other countries, unfortunately. And then another factor that's really significant that sort of happened at the same time is a big movement in many countries for the rights of women to not live subjected to domestic violence. And so the divorce rate went way up. And the indications are that the main reason the divorce rate went up was because women were leaving abusers. And when people talk about, oh, this is terrible, what a high divorce rate we have, they're not acknowledging that that's actually the main reason why it's gone up, is because until now, women were just stuck living there being abused, and their children were stuck there witnessing it. But the family court has not wanted to change the way it does business. And so it has just decided to mostly dismiss, without basis, the disclosures of of domestic violence. They don't call them disclosures, they call them allegations. That, they dismiss the disclosures of domestic violence, dismiss the disclosures of child sexual abuse that children are making, and just sort of go on as they were before. And then the third element is that a lot of professionals have discovered, unfortunately, that there's a tremendous amount of money to be made. And lawyers are making an incredible amount of money on these protracted divorces. Custody evaluators, particularly, there's a whole category of custody evaluator called guardian ad litem. Now they've brought in these new categories of something called a parent coordinator and something called a reunification therapist. It's just this ballooning of professionals who are making so much money. And there's an inherent conflict of interest in the system, because the less well the professionals help resolve the difficulty, the more money they make. Now, this is a very interesting thing to digest about family court processes. The worse job that you do, the more money you make. As a lawyer, as a custody evaluator, as a mediator, as a psychological evaluator, the more that you do things in a way that make the conflict worse, the more it's going to drag on for years and years, and the more your bank account is going to get really, really full. So
yeah,
now,
I'm shocked by how many people tell me that the guardian ad litem, who technically should be representing the children, actually knows about something like even child sexual abuse, figures out a way of minimizing it or dismissing it, or even suggesting that the child is lying. And I'm absolutely shocked. I mean, I thought we were beyond this kind of thing.
We should be beyond it. And instead, what's happening in the family court is that it's getting worse. And in fact, I've started to declare my belief, which is that the family court, I believe, has become the number one enabler of both domestic violence and child abuse across the continent. And
that's a powerful statement. That is a very powerful statement.
But the reason I believe that it's true, besides the obvious way that these things are becoming very widespread, and I'm actually involved in a research project right now to further look at what's happening to moms in these cases. But the other reason why I believe that it's true is that mothers cannot protect their children. The family court is forbidding them to protect. Well, you're going to have rafts of child abuse if the responsible parent isn't free to protect.
Right. So I mean, I've got thousands of women in my group. What in the world can they do?
Well, what they really need to do is organize, unfortunately, because the efforts to pass laws have often succeeded, and the family court judges just ignore them. And so the notion of we have to go through the legislature, our state legislature, or the U.S. Congress, and get better laws passed, unfortunately, just doesn't work, because because family court judges are just these bizarrely powerful. They don't have juries. It's not easy to appeal them. Most people don't have the money for an appeal, and the appeals court also isn't very interested in family court issues in most places. And so these judges can do whatever they want. And so our protest movements have to focus on protesting and interfering with the court directly, not on hoping that our state and federal legislatures will do anything about it, because it's not going to work. We have really good laws, actually, and we have very improved laws with respect to child custody in something like 35 out of the 50 United States, and it hasn't changed anything about what the family law judges are doing. Laws, that specifically address domestic violence and child abuse in custody matters, and they don't care. So what the abusers did was they focused on bringing in really growing their numbers, getting their organizations to have a lot more people in them. And they focused on pickets, on marching and picketing, and getting on the news and being out there at their rallies and pickets, being in front of the courthouse all the time. And this is very hard for moms to do. Moms don't have the kind of money that the abuser has, and they don't have the kind of time that the abuser has, because they're trying to raise their children. One of the first times that I was a custody evaluator, coincidentally, the father on the case was one of the most visible fathers' rights activists in the state of Massachusetts. And I didn't know as much about that movement yet, so I didn't even recognize his name. But over the next couple of years, I realized, he was a big name in the state of Massachusetts. Well, when I was interviewing his boys as part of my custody evaluation about, what do you do? How do you spend time with your father when you're over at his house? They said, "Oh, we don't really spend that much time with him when we're over at his house. He's very busy with his father's organization." This is literally what the boys said to me.
Wow.
And in other words, the Father's Rights Organization does not care about spending time with their children. They care about owning and controlling those children. That's the ultimate irony, to say, my father's not spending time with me because he's too busy with his father's organization. I mean, think about the implications of that. And so, of course, they can be out picketing, because the truth is they don't really care that much about the time with their kids. For moms, it's much harder to be out there on the picket line. But this is, I think, what mothers are going to have to do. And there's an organization that's just starting now called Mothers on the Rise.
Mothers on the Rise. Okay.
Yeah, that's really focused on helping moms do this kind of county by county, court by court organizing. It's creating a bunch of materials. It's going to have trainings, and it's going to just help moms figure out different strategies to find the other moms, because moms who are dealing with the custody system are so isolated. One of the comments I get most commonly to things I write about child custody is, "Oh, I didn't realize this was happening to anybody but me. I didn't know this was happening to tens of thousands of other mothers."
Wow. Of the existing organizations, where can I send the people in my group who are experiencing this? I know, for example, One Mom's Battle, which is a private Facebook group that deals with this. Where else can I send people who have, no money and no time to get some support, to feel like they're not alone?
There are almost no resources to help them with their case. Like, to look for any kind of legal advice or legal assistance, it almost doesn't exist. And that says a lot about where we stand at the moment, and how urgent it is to build a movement to fight for the custody rights of mothers, particularly mothers who've been abused or whose children have been abused. For fighting on the issue, not for help with their own case, but for fighting on the issue, I tend to point people a lot towards an organization called the Center for Judicial Excellence, which is really sounds like a very professional organization or something, but it's actually fighting very hard on these issues. It's a I would call it a grassroots organization. And the California Protective Parents Association, which is trying to fight for national reforms, not just for reforms in California. And then Mothers on the Rise. But I think very highly of the work that Tina Swithin is doing in One Mom's Battle, what you're referring to. So I think that's a great resource also. And if there's an online support network through her, then that's a great place for people.
Yeah, and that's free, and you can access that from the privacy of your cell phone. So how does a woman know she's up against? Are there any telltale signs that a woman is hearing father's rights lingo, and that she's up against something that she's going to need some more help against?
There are some classic things about sort of how father's rights people try to frame things. And actually, one of the main characters in the novel and In Custody gets involved with is involved with the father's rights movement, and his allies are all sort of spewing the same stuff. So they're fond of saying that mothers win 95% of contested custodies, which is just a complete lie. Mothers win 95% of uncontested custodies. Why? Because responsible fathers, who are the majority, are not out to take children away from their mothers. And it's abusers who are so focused on taking children away from their mothers. So it's contested custodies that matter. And actually the research that's been done, multiple research studies that have been done over the last decades, have found that, as of the late 1980s and certainly into the 1990s, fathers were winning more than they were losing if they fight for custody. And they're almost certainly going to get joint custody if they fight for custody. And joint custody is not a positive outcome when the father is abusive, either to the mother or to children. That's not a positive outcome. They're very fond of saying, well, 50-50 custody is what's best for kids. That's another father's rights line. That's total nonsense. Unfortunately, a lot of states are starting to bring in laws that mandate 50-50 custody. 50-50 custody isn't about children. 50-50 custody is about parents. It's about sort of that old metaphor of seeing the child as a loaf of bread that you're going to cut in half, and it's half for you and half for me. That has nothing to do with what's good for the loaf of bread. How children do best is in whatever care they were in prior to divorce. And so if they were in 90% of the time in their mother's care when their parents were together, then they should remain 90% of the time in their mother's care after the children split up. What I call an approximation standard, where what you're trying to do post-separation is approximate how things were before divorce. Well, that's not what the court does at all these days. The court tries to move towards 50-50 custody, which is just terrible for kids for so many different reasons. Except in a case where their father actually was providing half their care, but that's not common. Even today, that's not common. They have this line about the best parent is both parents, which suggest, which is they're trying to blame mothers and say that somehow mothers are trying to keep the fathers out of their children's lives. When I really look into these cases, when anyone investigates these cases carefully, what you find is the father's rights guys working very, very hard to try to get the mother out of the children's lives.
That's
so
true.
There's just so much hypocrisy. So one of the characters in my novel, In Custody, the main character's boyfriend, he pretends to be like an aggrieved father. He doesn't actually even have children, but he pretends that he's one of these aggrieved fathers in order to infiltrate the father's rights organization, near where they live. And I won't tell you what happens, but I can say a number of interesting and somewhat dangerous things ensue from him infiltrating this father's rights organization near where they live.
Let me ask you something. And I have heard all of those lines. And then from a religious standpoint, we often hear in our churches that a two-parent home is always better than a single parent home, which is, nonsense too. We know that from the Jaffe study and Music and Meyer and a lot of other studies, which I'm going to put in the show notes. Let me pivot for a second. Have you ever seen a woman successfully combat this stuff in court and turn it around?
Yes. And a writer named Joanna Silberg, who wrote a wonderful book that's not really about the child custody system. It's about helping children heal, called The Child Survivor. Joy Silberg has also done a really good presentation that I think you can find online about what she calls turned around cases. And I'll help you track it down so you can put it in your resources.
Yeah. Definitely want it in the show notes. Absolutely. And any other studies you've got that are showing that in contested custody cases, that abusers with credible allegations against them or disclosures, as you say, are getting custody. I'd love to have all of that in the show notes.
Well, those are mostly Joan Meyer studies already, having documented that really well. What you were referring to, but
okay, thank you.
I can make sure that you have those if you're missing any of them. I'm always cautious about this question because and I'll explain why, but then I'll still answer the question. The public often takes the view that she must not be fighting her case correctly. And so her friends and relatives and other concerned people are often saying, well, have you done this? Have you done this? Well, you should do this. Well, you should do that. Well, you should tell the court this, and not realizing she's already doing all those things. The family court is not operating in a rational way. And, people grow up with these detective novels, courtroom novels and movies, and they expect that there's going to be all this rules of procedure and rules of evidence, because that's what we see in the movies, and the objections being made and the judges sustaining or overruling the objections and that whole business. That's with a jury. And that's with an appeals court, because the appeals court watches what happens in criminal cases. And in the family court, there is no jury. The judge can do whatever he or she wants. And the judge is the one making the decisions, not the jury. And there are virtually no rules of evidence or rules of procedure, at least not that I've ever seen followed. I mean, I sit so much in family court hearings on different cases that I've either been connected to or have done evaluations for or whatever, or cases that I've been investigating. And there's just there doesn't seem to be any rules of evidence or rules of procedure. If there are, the judges are ignoring them, except when the judge wants an excuse to do something against the mother. Then the judge will suddenly say, well, sorry, the law just doesn't give me any latitude here. But they're happy to ignore the law in some cases in cases where it would make them not be allowed to do that to the mom. So that's the first thing, is for people to understand that unfortunately a mom can do everything right, and usually is doing everything pretty much right. And the judge just has so much power, and to try to file an appeal, first of all, is not likely to do much, but costs tens of thousands of dollars typically just to appeal. I'm not saying that the court fee costs that, but the lawyer fee costs that. So most people, appealing isn't really even an option. So, what have women tried that sometimes works? Well, it does try. It does help if you can find a lawyer who's willing to rip apart the custody evaluator. The lawyer is usually not willing to do that, because the lawyer doesn't want to make the judge mad, and the lawyer doesn't want to make the custody evaluator mad, because they have that same custody evaluator on other cases of theirs, and so they don't want to.
Right. I mean, people listening to us don't realize that there's usually an approved list of custody evaluators that the court allows you to choose from. So if that attorney is taking a big risk in ripping apart one of the custody evaluators on that list. And, attorneys are just people. They live in an area, they have to raise their own children in that area. And, they don't want to make the judge mad because they're going to have to try, another 30, 40 cases in their lifetime in front of this judge, maybe even hundreds. And so that is taking a big risk. And
the judge does not appreciate it if you've just ripped apart one of his or her favorite custody evaluators, and that custody evaluator doesn't appreciate it. So that person may get you back on a later case. And so women have this experience a lot where they're saying the custody evaluator lied, or the custody evaluator didn't even talk to the children, or, various things like that. And the lawyer will say, well, we better just try to go with what the custody evaluator is recommending, because the judge won't like it if we don't. And so strategically speaking, a mom has to try a lot of different things, of trying to find good witnesses, of trying to find an expert if she can afford an expert, of trying to get the hint across to the judge that she is prepared to appeal if somehow she has money for that. It's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Yeah, that is tough. And, I don't talk about my own situation, but I had an open and closed kind of situation, and I still went through the courts for 10 years. And I look back now and say, this is ridiculous. Why did I have to endure this for 10 years? When my situation, I had plenty of third-party experts on my side. And so something's really wrong with our situation. But I certainly know people who have lost everything to these judges who don't take any of their evidence seriously, who throw out what the children's therapist says, what the guardian ad litem, and in some cases, the guardians ad litem are actually quite good, but the judge doesn't listen. I'm happy to hear about these organizations that women can belong to, can contribute to, can start protesting. And I know that there is a history, especially in the state of Texas, of women rising up and saying, this isn't fair, this isn't right, what's going on, and actually making some headway. But it's a constant, nonstop process when you have fathers' rights organizations doing this routinely. That means mothers are going to have to do it too. And that's just a lot of work.
I think that's right, and especially because the fathers' rights have the money on their side. All these professionals I talked about make a lot of money by keeping an abusive father involved. Yeah, and so the money. I just remembered also, I should mention that there's a list of resources, like a resource of resources at the website for my book. So the website for my book is just called incustodythenovel.com. So if you go to incustodythenovel.com and click on resources, there's a bunch of different organizations and just all kinds of other information about child custody.
That's going to be so important. Now I do want to say, because I've also in my interviews found men who were victims, and So you and I are not saying that, women are always innocent and men are always guilty. We do have to follow wherever the evidence leads.
No, and in fact, well, first of all, when we're talking about domestic violence, that's almost always a male on female thing. It's very rare, despite a lot of rot that gets spread out there. It's actually very rare that you have female on male domestic violence. But with respect to child abuse, you certainly do have families where the abuser of the children is the mother. So the father is the one who's in some kind of position of trying to protect those kids. And he doesn't necessarily have much more success than a woman does at getting the family court to take seriously the risk of the children. What I do notice, though, is that while the family court may ignore his concerns, it doesn't jump on him with both feet. The way it jumps on a mother for trying to protect her children. Like, I've never encountered a father who has ended up on supervised visitation, not because of his own behavior, but because of his complaints about the mother's behavior. Whereas it's now become quite common that a mother, believe it or not, is being put on supervised visitation, not because of anything she did, but because of her raising complaints about what the father's done. The court says, well, it's really not good for the kids because you're poisoning the kids' minds with the notion that their father's doing these things. So we're going to put you on supervised visitation. And
yeah, I hear that a lot. I hear that a lot in my group.
I've never heard of that happening to a father. So yes, a protective father can be in a really rough position in the family court, but he doesn't typically end up in the same position that a protective mother ends up in there.
Yeah, it's definitely a double standard. So Lundy, I have a tough question to ask you. And that is, for some people, genuinely, it seems like the only answer left is for them to run, escape, hide. If the court completely is against them, this judge doesn't listen to any evidence, doesn't weigh it the way it would be weighed in a criminal trial, for example. What can a woman do? How do you run? And is that even advisable? And what are the pros and cons?
Well, first of all, running was never easy, but it's become harder and harder and harder because we live in a society where there's more and more and more surveillance, and it's just harder and harder to not get found. They've gotten if a mom runs with the child before the case ever goes to court, she's in a much better position, because if the case has never been to court, then that's not generally thought of as a kidnapping charge.
Got it.
Once the case has been to court and there's even a temporary custody order, then that's going to be kidnapping, or at least custodial interference, if she flees.
So strategically, if you've got loving parents in another state, go now before you file for divorce, or before you have your first hearing.
I think probably before you even file, but that would be a little over my head. I shouldn't really.
Okay, we won't speculate from a legal standpoint, but you're basically saying run early
before you have a custody order, before you have even a temporary custody order.
Okay,
and before there's a legal separation or anything. And the other thing I would say is you really want to think carefully about whether it's worth it, because you're going to basically, until your kids are 18, you're going to be always looking over your shoulder. There's always going to be the possibility that you could be found. You're really going to have to stay out of contact with everybody for good. I mean, the sacrifices are huge. Like basically your relatives, you're going to have to just not talk to them during the whole time your kids are growing up. There are so many people, unfortunately, who trust their relatives, and then their relatives betray their whereabouts.
Right. Even well-meaning relatives betray the whereabouts because they get sucked into an abuser's, tears and confession and remorse. Exactly. And this happens all the time in religious situations, because we're taught to forgive and forget and give second chances and things like that. So it's very easy for even caring parents, family, and friend to get sucked in by the abuser.
Yeah, it's very, very frustrating, discouraging, how much success the abuser has in collecting allies, and as you're saying, in getting people to feel sorry for him. And so so she just has to make a really tough set of decisions about, like, is this really going to be worth it for me? Is this really going to be worth it for my kids? And if she's caught, even if she's caught 5 years from now, she's probably going to be the one who barely gets to spend any time with those kids. They're suddenly going to be pretty much all the time with the abuser. And so you have to be really have quite a bit of confidence that you can do this without getting caught. And that's probably as much as I should say. You can find help. You can find help. I can't tell you how to find it. I don't even really totally know how to find it. In custody, I talk about the fact that these networks that help women flee are very real, but I didn't find in my research for that book exactly how you connect, how you locate them. I don't know what those communication paths are. I made fictional ones for the novel for how people find out about these networks. And actually, I was saying the main character's boyfriend infiltrates a father's rights organization. Well, she herself infiltrates one of these networks that's helping moms. So like he's infiltrating on the abuser side and she's infiltrating on the mother side to try to figure out how these organizations are working. Right. And but in reality, the networks are not easy to find, and their reputation is that they're going to check out pretty carefully whether you're telling the truth or not. And I hope that's true, because I wouldn't want them to be helping someone who might be fleeing for retaliatory, to punish the father or for some other reason. But the cases that I've looked into, the evidence has not been just convincing; it's been overwhelming.
Yeah,
and I've looked at these cases of women who fled.
You bring up such an important thing. We're not talking that all women are good and saintly and all men are horrible. These groups, apparently, from what your book is saying, is that they really check you out. They look at the past history of domestic violence calls and all kinds of things. So, they are not going to be suckered in by someone who is retaliatory, because we do know, look at all the books on written by children of narcissistic mothers who are vicious and mean and cruel. We know those kinds of women do exist.
Right.
But so it's really important that any of these organizations really do the background check and weigh the evidence in ways that the courts are not.
My main character in the novel and In Custody is a young journalist who doesn't know anything about any of these issues. And so early in the book, she's totally believing the kind of standard stuff that divorce professionals are saying about, how the children need both parents and how they just feel caught in the middle and, all this stuff. And how moms are out to use domestic violence allegations to try to take children away from their fathers. And so she's just believing all these myths because that's what the people with the most credentials, the biggest, most impressive degrees and so forth are telling her. And then she starts to little by little start to hear the other side and start to hear about how much the court is actually refusing to address abuse and is just like we were saying, enabling abusers. And she starts to get these little inclinations. And so then she starts to try to learn a little bit about like what might drive someone to the point where running with her children really feels like the only way she's going to be able to keep her children from being horribly abused. And she, little by little, she starts to have a little more sympathy for why a mom might flee, but that's not her starting point. She has to go through quite a process of learning about what's going on. And in the process, she learns about some very real cases that were actually from the news that I had her sort of stumble into. And that becomes part of her education when she sees things like what happened to, I talked about this case that's fairly famous where the mom's name was Katie Tagle, Tagle. When you learn about what happened in the Katie Tagle case, that one case alone is enough to make you realize, like, there's a really serious problem here.
Yeah, I appreciated that in the back of your book, you list 5 or 6 cases that people can look up themselves.
Right.
Katie Tagle, Catherine Sherlock, Hera McLeod, Amy Hunter, Jacqueline Franchetti, and I'm sorry, I probably messed up poor Hera's last name, but McLeod. These are real people whose lives were really destroyed in the court system when they had more than adequate evidence that would certainly pass in a criminal trial And in fact, that brings up something. I do have a number of women who say, I can't seem to win in family court. Maybe I should just criminally charge my husband. And are you seeing very many women doing that? And of course, vice versa.
It's usually very hard to do when a lot of time has passed since the event.
Okay.
But also the family court tends to, let's say the abuser and his lawyers tend to try to play the criminal court off the family court and the family court off the criminal court. So if she files a criminal charge, they'll say to the criminal court, she's just using this to try to help her in the custody battle. And then they'll run to the family court and say, she's doing this over at the criminal court to, and try to make it. And the courts don't communicate with each other.
Okay. So it sounds like a no-win situation for a lot of these women.
Yeah. So I think it's often worth pursuing the criminal option, but you tend to have the right circumstances. You have to have the right evidence. It hasn't been too long since the last thing happened. With respect to child sexual abuse, it's extremely hard to prosecute when kids are very young.
Yeah, and the parents don't want them to testify and things like that.
But it's certainly worth looking into and inquiring about. And again, that's one of those things that the sooner the better, because the more time has passed since he committed the offense, the less your chances become of ever being able to prosecute it.
Yeah. So. I do want to talk about the situation where sometimes either during the divorce or after the divorce, the children actually side with the abusive parent. Now, most of what I see in my group, the children side with the nurturing parent. And I would say in my group, I'm doing a poll right now in my group, 8 and 10 of the people in my group say that at least one of their children are absolutely supportive of the divorce because it was the best option in a horrific situation. But many of these are homeschool families where they have between 5 and maybe even 12 children. And so they will say, well, okay, so 10 of my children side with me, but 2 do not. What I would love to ask you, and maybe we have time now, what do you do when the children side with the abuser, and how do you keep that from happening?
And because that is a long discussion, I think what I'll mostly do is just point people to resources. So first of all, much as I hate to push my own books, I have to recommend one of my own, which is called When Dad Hurts Mom. And it's a book that's for mothers. That's who it was written for, about helping your children navigate these waters. So it's just called When Dad Hurts Mom. The subtitle is Helping Your Children Heal the Wounds of Witnessing Abuse. But that book gives lots and lots of strategies for how to talk to your kids, how to help them become strong and critical thinking people, how to help them see through their father without talking badly about their father. In other words, you have to teach them to use their own critical thinking skills rather than sort of brainwash them against their father, because it won't work.
Yeah, no, and the other thing
in the brainwashing conflict, he will win because he's better. That's what the abuser specializes in. But you can teach kids to think for themselves, and that's, he can't beat you at that. And
okay, so I'm going to promote your book, and also you've got 3 brand new blog posts on your website in the last 30, 60 days on this topic. So I'm going to put those in the show notes too.
That's great. And that's just lundybancroft.com. I did one post that was about kids who side with mom, and then a series of posts about kids who side with the abuser and some strategies about how to deal with that. And then we'll do a follow-up post on more about kids who do side with mom. And I want to say one other thing about When Dad Hurts Mom, which is that most of the chapters in that book end with a section called What Can I Do? So I really tried to get very specific for moms about things to try, because you got to just fight for your relationship with those kids, because he's going to try to poison them against you. And you got to just do everything you can think of to try to have the strongest possible relationship that you can have.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Maybe we'll do a follow-up on that topic, but we've given people a good starting place, your book, and then the blog posts. because I know this is a genuinely, it's a real problem. So thank you so much today, Lundy. I appreciate this so much.
You're very welcome. Good luck to you and good luck to your audience. And thanks for having this conversation.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.
If you benefited from this recording, you will find support and clarity in my book, The Life-Saving Divorce, available in paperback or Kindle on Amazon and in 2022 as an audiobook. You can also follow me, Gretchen Baskerville, on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. You can sign up for my email list at lifesavingdivorce.com. Women and men of faith may request to join my private Facebook group, Life-Saving Divorce. For more on life-saving divorces, please subscribe and click the link to the next recording.